So, who are you and what do you do?
My name's Alex Edmans. I'm a professor of finance at London Business School and author of May Contain Lies: How Stories, Statistics and Studies Exploit Our Biases and What We Can Do About It.
Love the name of the book. Well done.
Well, thank you. It's partly my publisher, not just due to me, but thanks anyway. I'll accept it on their behalf as well.
Yeah, I'm sure they would take it on my behalf as well. So let's start talking about maybe where we are. This idea of a post-truth world. This word we hear a lot of truthiness, which I think was a Jon Stewart line at one point.
Yeah.
Can you help center us in this world where we are so grappling, even with the idea of what is a fact, a truth, reality?
Yeah, so we hear the phrase post-truth all the time, so much so it's a cliche, we don't stop and think about what it means. So what many people think it means is about whether something is a true fact or not, whether something can be proven or disproven. So you might say people are claiming that Barack Obama was not a natural-born US citizen. That is a post-truth. You can produce his birth certificate and falsify that. But what I want to highlight is that the idea of post-truth is beyond that. You can have something which is 100% true, but the inferences that you draw from that can be misleading. So let's give an example. So there's a famous TED talk and book by Simon Sinek called Start with Why, which claims that Apple is successful because it started with a Y. Now, Apple is clearly one of the most successful companies in the world, and I believe Simon Sinek, it started with Y. But that is one cherry-picked example. There could be hundreds of other companies that started with Y and failed. We never hear about them because Sinek doesn't write about them in his book because they don't support his story. So even if you have something which is fully accurate and can be verified, you can still have post-truths because you have misleading inferences.
So, where does that fit in a world where one of the famous words we're hearing a lot in the media is proportionality? So, in order to get to a place where we would say start with why works, what are we looking for numerically? What would help us validate that? Is it simply the fact that it's one of many things Apple did? Is it the fact that we have to have many companies who had a very similar? How do we construct this in a way where we can look to this as some type of light, guiding light?
I think this is a great question because you need to draw this line somewhere. Because if you can only stick to things that you can prove with 100% certainty, then we'll probably be able to claim just very few things to begin with. So
Right.
there's a phrase in academia, there's a trade-off between identifying nothing precisely and precisely nothing. So if our bar for accuracy is so high, then we're not going to be able to make any claims, and therefore we're going to be living in a vacuum, not guided by anything. So one guidance is statistical significance. So what does that mean? What does that mean for a layman, a normal person who's not wanting to be in statistics all the time? That is a result likely with a 95% probability to be true. So let me give an example. So let's say that going vegetarian improves your health. Now, if you found that people who only eat vegetables were healthier, that could still be due to randomness. And so, what statistical significance suggests is that is the additional improvement in health that you get from being vegetarian enough to be so large that you can rule out randomness.
So does that put us in a place where it would be hard to attach almost any of these labels in terms of business? You're at the London School of Business, the London Business School. I think about this all the time. My latest trope is success is a complete anomaly. And
Mm,
that frustrates people. But I feel like that's more statistically accurate
yeah.
than making these passages.
I do think it's true. And this might seem bizarre for me to say as an academic researcher who would love to say everybody should read my research and follow it to the letter, but that would be misleading. So we often have these phrases like there's indisputable proof, there's overwhelming evidence, and that is very rarely the case, particularly in something like social sciences, where you don't have two carbon 14 atoms where you keep everything constant and just change the temperature. Here, there's a lot going on. But if you want to be a bestseller, you will say, I found the secrets to the success, or these are the 5 things we want to do to get your kid into Harvard, or the 6 things to do in order to start a company and be successful. In reality, there's lots of different factors. Well, does that mean we can say nothing? Again, going back to my prior response, absolutely not. But we can just be suggestive and not too prescriptive and recognize there's many different ways to be successful rather than trying to impose one particular way.
So, what are we ultimately looking for? I guess the solution that I'm thinking about is why do we attach ourselves onto these types of ideas and concepts if ultimately they don't really hold any scientific weight to them? And ultimately, it's not really going to change my outcome in that moment. So what is it about humanity that makes us so attached or attracted to these types of tags and lines?
Well, I think just to give people the benefit of the doubt is the fact that people do want to improve themselves, which is great. So you want to better yourself, be this in career spheres or be this in health. And so if there is a study claiming that if you do something, you will be successful. So let's take the Atkins diet. So that says if you just cut out all carbs, then you will lose weight. And that seems to be something which would work because there is a sacrifice and we will think no pain, no gain. And if we cut out carbs, no matter how much we like bread or fruit, that might seem that it's going to be working. So that very blunt message is easier to put into practice than something such as, well, eat between 30 and 45% of your diet in carbs. So that's so difficult to put into practice. You need to look at how many carbs and proteins and fats you consume, and then you convert this into calories, taking into account the different calorific content. Maybe you'd have to try to stratify between complex carbs and simple carbs. So anything which is a more nuanced message is harder to put into practice. Something which is quite blunt, we will try to follow, even if it's actually misleading, even if things are much more complex than that. If we think it's the solution, we will put all our eggs into one basket and try to adhere to that letter.
So, this is about nuance, it's about this bluntness. Why? I still go to the why of this. Why do we get so caught up in this if historically we were people that spent most of our days hunting for shelter, food, and survival? What evolved over time that has fed us into this? I guess we could look at everything from our diet to our attention spans to how we use technology. Everything seems to be this hack, this
Mm.
search for productivity, this ability to find efficiency. And yet, what we're discovering through these conversations and just our own is, we have a 1 or 2% success rate in these
Mm.
types of things sometimes.
I think it's great that you brought up history because I think that this is something that has always been with us throughout history rather than being something which we've developed over the last few decades or even centuries. So, if you go back to our hunter gatherer ancestors, they had to make tons of decisions, and those decisions were life or death decisions sometimes, unlike the time and space that we have right now. And so, if you have to make a high stakes decision, you'd have to use a black or white or blunt rule. That rule could be run from carnivores. So you see an animal, you think, do we fight it? Do we flee from it? Or do we just not respond? Now, something like run from carnivores, and you can identify carnivores with eyes in the front of the head and sharp teeth, that would work in most situations. Sometimes it wouldn't. You might run from a dog when the dog could be useful because if you domesticate it, it can help with the hunt. But you just want to make sure that you avoid death. That is the biggest and most serious thing. Similarly, you might think berries are good, so if you're hungry, let's eat something which looks like a berry, even though sometimes it might be poisonous. So, always we've had this desire to have black and white rules which we can apply quickly. Nowadays, maybe speed is not of the essence because immediate death and immediate hunger, that's not something which we need to deal with, perhaps. But what the challenge is something different. It's not speed, but it's scale. Like we need to process lots of information in a particular timescale. So let's say you're an investment manager and you run a sustainable fund. You could invest in literally thousands of stocks around the world. You're not going to analyze every single one. So you have a black and white rule, such as fossil fuels are bad, then you can easily evaluate a fossil fuel company and say, well, I should not invest in this as a sustainable asset manager. In reality, some fossil fuels might be good because they might actually be leading the pack in terms of moving towards renewable energy, but that nuance is something which is too complex for a time pressed asset manager who's got thousands of stocks to evaluate.
Let's shift a little bit into May Contain Lies. I'm curious what the moment was where you realized this has to be a book. I think about the contentious nature of our society and how we're organizing and how we're thinking about information. It's a book that probably could have come out 10 or 15 years ago, even. And if I just look at the scale of things, because I think you're right, speed is kind of tiring to me as well, that it's crazier than ever. This idea that, or the level of manipulation that we're seeing is really scary, where even people who are thoughtful about it, who are very media literate, are not just falling prey to it, but don't know where to turn.
Yes, and indeed, this is something where the genesis was many years prior to right now. So in 2017, I was invited to give a TEDx talk, and that was the second talk I was invited to give. The first one, I presented my own research on sustainable finance, as you normally do, right? It's a great stage to market your work. And that was my initial instinct for my second talk. But then I thought, well, what if we have this problem of misinformation and confirmation bias? So, what it means is that people will accept any research where they like the findings, and they will reject research if it contradicts their worldview, no matter how rigorous it is. And then for me, as a finance professor, as an academic, if my purpose is to present research and then people only respond to research based on whether they like their findings, then what I do and what my colleagues do is pretty much futile. So I thought for that talk, rather than to present my paper, let me speak about the scientific method in general, let me explain the dangers of confirmation bias, latching onto a study because we like the findings, irrespective of its rigor. And so I was really glad that this got elevated to a main stage TED talk called What to Trust in the Post-Truth World. I thought, fantastic, that's going to stop the problem of misinformation. Well, clearly I had an overinflated sense of the impact of that talk. So yes, it has been viewed a number of times, but if anything, misinformation has got worse. And so that's why I thought, well, I can't just stop with this 17-minute talk. Let me write a book about it. And importantly, with the book, I wanted it to be not just in my home turf of economics and finance, because unfortunately we do see misinformation in politics, in health advice, in science, and even things like parenting. And so that was the genesis.
Just curious how you sleep at night. I mean, I don't know if I could handle waking up in the morning. I can barely handle waking up in the morning, even if I shift between a CNN and a Fox News with my journalism background, my publishing background, my media background. I can see and dance through some of it. And then there's just some that's so overwhelming. A great example would be the craziness that's happening in the Middle East, where there are so many very wildly different perspectives that it's hard to even understand, where am I being manipulated? Where is the misinformation? And is it possible that there are six sides to a story?
Mm. Well, I'm lucky because of my upbringing. So, the first school I went to was a Montessori school, and that school system is about questioning. So, rather than indoctrination, you are the kids, you need to learn something from rote, you are always asked to question and challenge. And that was something which I thought was really, really useful. In England, you specialize very early. So, you finish school at 18, you do what's known as A levels, and you typically focus on just three subjects or four. And most people will do maths, physics, chemistry, or they'll do completely humanities, something like history, geography, and French. I did a combination of both, and then I ended up being in social sciences and economics, where you do have theories, so it's not purely subjective, but those theories are not set in stone, linking back to our early conversation that you don't have definitive proof. We could both see the same data. I could argue taxes should be higher. Mitch, you could look at the data and say, no, I think taxes should be lower, and we can both have legitimate views. And for me to have a more informed view, I would want to listen to you and listen to your view and respect it rather than try to contradict it, and then my worldview would become better. And so that's something I've been lucky to have as an academic. So part of an academic's job is not just to write papers, but then you take them on the road, you present them at other universities, you get pushback, you get critique, you take it all constructively, and based on that, you will make your paper better. And that's why, for me at least, I can sleep, not every single night, but most nights I can sleep better than you might think.
But you're still looking, you're still in the ecosystem. We all are. You're seeing news. You understand probably better than others statements like the data proves, the research shows. We are seeing multiple sources state that. These are all moments that you're saying, in particular in the book, these should be a bit illuminating for you, like stand back and look at them. But ultimately, again, you're an intellectual. I'd like to consider myself somewhat intellectual, that it feels like almost like a shell game where they've gotten so good at it that it's really hard to follow the peanut underneath the nut cover to figure out where things are going. And I'm wondering, one is why we as humans have to deal with this as at an infrastructure. It seems like it's happening everywhere.
Yeah, so I'll first talk about why we have to deal with, and then second, how can I still sleep at night despite it going on? So why do we have to deal with it? Because the incentives to produce misinformation are huge. Why? So if misinformation goes with the grain, if it's something that people want to be true, if it plays on their confirmation bias, they are number one likely to accept it uncritically, even if there's not clear evidence behind it. And number two, they're going to share it and tell other people to read it. And so, some simple message, such as start with why, that plays into our confirmation bias. That's empowering. That suggests anybody can be successful if you just have enough passion, if you just have enough purpose. And even if there's no evidence behind this, then this will become a bestseller and the talk will be viewed many, many times. And why is this a problem, particularly in 2024 compared to maybe 10 years ago? Well, because now you can write a book about it and that book can be sold, you can blog about it, you can write a Substack. Your ability to have a wide impact is not now much better because of social impact. Because of social media, sorry. And then how does this lead me then to sleep at night when I see this going on? Well, if there is misinformation in my field, I will try to call it out respectfully. And so this is the reason I wrote the May Contain Lies book, and I do highlight the flaws in some really impactful books. And these might be by authors who I might want to build positive relationships with, that being a fellow author, but the goal of writing the book is not to ingratiate myself with these people. If I think they've written something which is not accurate, then irrespective of the consequences for me, I think it's my duty as an academic scientist who understands the data to point out these issues. And unfortunately, the problems are far too big for just to be contained in the book. So there's many other issues that I'll try to call attention to on my website, maycontainlies.com. But as you're suggesting, I need to be realistic, because if every single bit of misinformation I try to call out, then I would not have time to sleep because there's so much misinformation out there. So I will try to stick with my main field of work, which is sustainability and related responsible business topics, and also go after the most high profile studies. Why? Even though they might be from the most influential companies who I might want to have a nice consultancy contract with, and I lose that ability, those are the most impactful studies. And so those are the ones which are most important to draw attention to, if indeed they're misleading.
Alex, what if we said, listen, I get what you're doing, but calm down here. Like it's just marketing, it's just PR. We're embellishing to make the message more profound. What's your reaction to that?
My reaction would be these things have serious consequences. So with the Atkins diet book, that was marketing. So the publisher told Dr. Atkins, don't have any references here or any bibliography. This is not a scientific book. This is a book that will be read by people. And so millions of people bought the Atkins diet. They follow the diet. Some might have died from it. So Dr. Atkins himself may have been a casualty. So he collapsed and he had high saturated fat in his bloodstream, which could have been a consequence of eating so much meat. There was a letter written to the New England Journal of Medicine claiming that in a particular sample, people who took opioids did not get addicted. That was a letter. It was not peer reviewed by anybody. That letter has been cited about 600 times as if it was scientific research and been used to highlight that opioids are not dangerous. And as we know, in the US, we've had a severe opioid epidemic, and this was in part due to some research which was a bit flimsy. It was just quoted in a letter, but people thought it was gospel. So I do think there's serious consequences. Some of them could be life or death situations like opioids or the Atkins diet. Others could be more minor things. What is the best way to lose weight or improve your health? But if somebody is devoting maybe 5 hours a week to the gym and doing a program which is actually not going to be particularly effective, then their life is going to be worse off if they're not following the science, but somebody's simple, quick fix tips.
How often do you see things in the news where you go, yeah, that's actually, they got it? Or is it just at a point now where there's so much of this and there's so much gaslighting and so much need to push clicks that what's the point in even looking at this?
I still see the glass as half full, not half empty. So I will specifically focus on my field of sustainable finance, and that was something which was very polarized. So initially, you had many people saying this is just amazing, all companies should be extremely sustainable. Then you had a pushback, and some people will say that pushback is politically motivated and ideological. But irrespective of the motive, what that has led to is us getting somewhere closer to the middle. And now you see what I'll call the silent majority, people who don't shout loudly at either extreme, they tend to be very supportive of nuanced articles. So I do think there are many open-minded and nuanced people who like messages which are in the middle and who know that in reality we don't have things being black and white. And I think that's how other fields might come about. So maybe with something like artificial intelligence, where there's some people saying there's huge amounts of hype, there's so much potential, others saying, well, this will get rid of humanity, it will lead to the destruction of what it means to be human if now AI can now write poetry and songs. In reality, we might get somewhere in the middle, and it's through this sort of going from one extreme to other extreme process that might be uncomfortable, but in the end, hopefully, we will see, as with nearly everything else in life, there's benefits and costs, and we're going to have a more nuanced position.
Yeah, that's actually a more optimistic approach that you're taking to generative AI than I would have assumed you would have. Because if somebody has the incentives for misinformation, this just provides them the tool and pipe to put it out at scale.
It could do, and so there's certainly concerns with this. So we already know that often quotes are attributed to people like
Yeah.
Albert Einstein or Mark Twain or Thomas Edison who never said those quotes. And now it'd be very easy to use generative AI to, for example, put a statement out in the tone of a particular policymaker or famous author, and people think it's going to be true. But on the other hand, AI could be a solution to these issues. So sometimes what AI might do is you can ask it a question and it will try to look at scientific consensus rather than being swayed by one individual study. So just like we can by mistake be swayed by Apple starting with Y, you could have the anti-vaccination movement trying to lean on one particular article by Andrew Wakefield in The Lancet, but something which looks at the evidence in general, which we can't easily do ourselves, maybe because it's just too time consuming. That's something we can ask AI to do. And this idea of looking at scientific consensus rather than the one paper that accords with our view might help us actually get more informed. So, like with many things, it could be partly a solution and partly a problem.
I'm hanging on to something you said earlier, where you talked about the fact that a lot of this is incentive driven. And I was trying to think of the polar opposite of that. And in thinking of that, I don't know that I came to a place intellectually that's any different than that output. Meaning, if you were to be truthful and write articles that had all of the research, it followed the 4 steps that you provided in the book, it would still be interesting, valuable. So why is it that we have to do, like, what is that incentive? I'm not sure I get that the incentive to be misinformation has more value than the ability to just report versus editorialize on, let's say, something like the news.
Because in many topics, people do have pre-existing views, and anything that you say which is in accordance with that view will do very well. So I've mentioned Simon Sinek already. He gave the third most popular TED Talk of all time. What is the second most popular TED Talk? This is the one called "Your Body Language Shapes Who You Are" by Amy Cuddy. The idea that if you do power poses, so for example, standing with your arms upstretched in a victory salute before public speaking or before an interview, you'll do better. And again, it accords with your viewpoints. Why? Because we like to believe we can take control of our life with a simple life hack. That's a common phrase today. And if you could do something simple to help you improve performance, and it kind of makes sense that you're going to be affecting your emotions and your confidence, you'll have a better outcome. And even though that book has been debunked, and that even though Amy Cuddy's been removed from her Harvard position, at the time of writing the book, if I went to Amazon, it said editor's pick. So still, this was recommended by the Amazon editors, despite it having been debunked. So again, there's huge financial incentives to give what sells. You could also write a book about a 4-hour work week by Tim Ferriss, saying you can be successful with just 4 hours of working. Or the 4-hour body, you only need to exercise for 4 hours a week as long as it's well allocated. But these messages, which sound empowering, even if they're not based on science, these are ones that get lapped up. And so you've seen many people become extremely successful based on that.
Hmm. What have you seen that has made you think, yes, this is 100% accurate? Is it mostly stuff out of academic that's been peer reviewed? How do you feel about the notion of peer review? We're hearing a lot of contentious commentary around even things being peer reviewed at this point.
Yeah, so I think peer review is good, but it's not perfect. So what is peer review to begin with? What you have is
Yeah.
it just completely reset. Should we just we'll just record that particular question? I just hope that it's not it will not have
Yeah, this is why
messed
like
up all
I'm
the.
wondering what's going on because I'm just wondering because it's still at 0% and it's very weird
Okay.
that it just did that. Like I'm seeing nothing here. So and again, I'm not blaming you, just
Yes.
I don't know what's going on here. Here's what I'm thinking, to be honest. What I'm thinking
Yeah.
is let's set another date to record this and let's even see if the first 20 minutes show up in my inbox. Is that workable for you?
It will do. So let me just do a speed test now. So
Because I don't want to do an hour to find out it's not there. I'd
no, I
rather
know. I fully
see.
understand. So.
Yeah, because if the 20 minutes are there, I'll just say, remember what you're wearing, and we'll just record. You know, yeah, and I know that usually I know if there's construction, my everything here looks very very strong. So I don't know. It could be just like the line in your neighborhood or something's like it's always random. It's the internet.
Yeah. So it says 3.79 megabit Mbps upload and 7 download. So
Seems
that
fine.
7 is yeah.
Yeah, I just wonder if it's like noise line, just like the ISPs and stuff. Can we book something now just to
Yeah, we
would that work for you?
could, yes.
Let's book something because, like I said, I'd rather just see what happens when we hang up. And if I
Sure.
even get the first 20 minutes, if I do, then great. Then we'll just record for like 30 or whatever. And if not, at least we're not wasting the full time. Because I
Yeah, it
definitely
says
love this conversation. I want you on the show.
yeah. It says 3% uploaded. So
Oh
uploading. So
yeah, I do
does
see
that
that.
suggest
I'm,
4%
now
now?
it's gone to
So we
4. I mean, it's up to you. I can keep going,
yeah.
and if we have to
Yeah.
record, we record. It's up to you. I just don't want to waste your time.
No, but I also want to respect yours. But I think given we're on a roll, and given that for continuity issues, like I would obviously wear the same thing, but the light is the same. I'm happy to
Yeah,
continue.
it's fine.
So
Okay, let's keep going. I
so
am
I think
seeing
you had the peer
5%
review
now, so
question.
hopefully,
Okay.
yeah. So actually, I already said it, so you can just jump in
Yeah, I can just
and
jump in.
start talking about peer review.
So I think peer review is useful, but it's not perfect. So what is peer review to begin with? So when you submit a manuscript to an academic journal, the editor, and I did this job myself for 6 years, you send it to independent experts, so the leading experts in that topic around the world, to review the diligence of the method and make sure that it's accurate. And it is stringent. So 95% of papers at the top journals will get rejected. And even the other 5%, they don't get accepted either. You typically have to revise the paper to address the peer reviewer's concerns. So this is really useful because it reduces the risk of flimsy papers being published. And indeed, most of the papers that I discussed on the May Contain Lies website and also in the book were non-peer reviewed papers. They were produced by companies like McKinsey or BlackRock who don't submit their papers to peer review, they just put it on their website. But you're absolutely right, Mitch, to highlight that peer review has been called into question. And I think the best way to reply to that is to say, well, academics are people too. So academics, unfortunately, do make mistakes. We have our own biases. And if indeed papers are written by very famous people, so right now there's a controversy surrounding Francesca Gino at Harvard. I'm not going to opine on as to whether the concerns are valid, but I'll acknowledge there are concerns. She's somebody who's at a top business school and was a leading light in dishonesty research. So if papers are written by her, you as an editor or you as a peer reviewer are more likely to think that it's correct. So what does this mean for us as consumers of research for the person on the street? Well, it means that we still should place attention on whether something is peer reviewed. It's still good, but perfect should not be the enemy of the good. It's not perfect, but it is good. But on the other hand, we shouldn't be too swayed by one particular paper. We want to look at the body of evidence or the density of studies. And one question that I suggest in the book is the following. If the same paper was written by the same author but had the opposite result, would the author have still published it? And if you're somebody whose entire career has been showing how dishonesty affects behavior, such as dishonesty research, you might think, well, this is just supportive of all of the other work that she's done. She would never write a paper showing that you can't change dishonesty. So that's something where you might be suspicious that it's supporting a particular agenda. So you might want to look at papers by other people in the field who might have written on the topic, but might have had papers on both sides. So I work in sustainable finance. I have some papers showing the benefits of sustainable finance, but also its limitations.
So when you talk about the limitations, are you saying you're as apt to put out the information because you're acting in a certain way, almost non-binary to the outcome? You're talking about just the betterment of the industry at whole, and there's going to be corruption as well as there are going to be great examples. Is that what you're ultimately saying? That don't be beholden, essentially drop the confirmation bias would be the simplest way to say this.
That's what I try to do. Maybe I don't always get it right, but that's certainly what I intend to do. So I would liken it to being a expert witness in a criminal trial. So it could be that I'm an expert witness in the most high profile case where somebody's been accused of the most heinous crimes and everybody thinks that they are guilty. But if a attorney was to ask me, is this conclusive evidence that the person was guilty? Did you find his fingerprints? And I didn't find the fingerprints, I would have to say no. Now, there's some people who say to me, Alex, sometimes you argue that this pro ESG sustainability research is not valid. Aren't you worried you're going to give ammunition to the anti sustainability people who want to knock it down? Well, actually, no, because that's not my job. My job is not to think about the political ramifications of what I'm saying, but to make sure that what I say is accurate. And no matter how much you feel that this person was guilty, no matter how much you find his or her crimes abhorrent, if indeed their fingerprints were not on the alleged murder weapon, it's your duty as a scientist to say so. Otherwise, just like the police lose their credibility if they are to plant evidence or misrepresent evidence, we as a scientific profession will also lose our credibility if we would only support what we would want to be true.
But do you worry then about it being politicized or weaponized? Because it seems like that's the exact way the tool will best be amplified.
I do worry about this, but how do I try to make sure that those concerns are attenuated without compromising my integrity as a scientific researcher? Maybe the best way to illustrate this is with a concrete example. So there's a lot of research out there claiming that diversity improves firm performance by McKinsey's, by BlackRock's, and so on. They're measuring demographic diversity. They show that the more ethnic minorities or the more women on the board, firm performance skyrockets. Now, unfortunately, as I wrote in the book and on my website, a lot of these papers are very flimsy, making some of the most basic errors. But because diversity is something people feel very strongly about, they want it to be true, even these basic errors are swept under the carpet, ironically, because diversity is about being open to different viewpoints and being questioned. So when I write my discerning papers highlighting the problems with this, I make very clear that this does not invalidate diversity initiatives. I'll say things like absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. This particular paper being incorrect does not mean that there's not other better papers. And also, it might suggest that actually diversity is just richer than just demographic, just ethnic and gender diversity. The way in which these papers measure diversity with just gender and ethnicity, this is so blunt. This suggests that no white male can ever add any diversity to the organization, even though maybe they were the first person in their family ever to go to college. Maybe their background is in humanities and everybody else is in sciences. So there's so many other aspects of a diversity. All I'm claiming, and this is I try to make very clear, is that these very blunt measures of diversity are not linked to performance, but it may well be the case that a broader set of measures is, and therefore I decided to look at this myself in my own research. I gathered a more holistic measure of diversity, which also incorporates equity and inclusion, and I do find that that is correlated with better future firm performance, and therefore when I raise concerns about these more narrow studies, this is not me attacking the DEI movement more generally.
Yeah, I just wish there was some body on top of this that would mitigate the challenge of 50 large corporations then holding up Alex's thoughts and saying, see, we don't have to pursue all this. We should just be hiring XYZ or for XYZ. There's a lot of examples of this. You have, I believe it's Colin Hughes, who talks a lot about status versus race, how that might be the better way to do that. If you have the class versus, I mean, there's a lot of what I would call contentious things. And what's fascinating to me is here we sit, mid 2024 as we record this. But I wonder, Alex, had you said this a year and a half ago, you might be canceled.
Yeah, and this is the concern. And I think one of the reasons why I'm not cancelled is because I'm an ethnic minority. So people think that I'm not ideologically against DEI. But that's ridiculous, right? People should listen to me based on the quality of my argument, not the colour of my skin. So even if I was a white male making the same argument, you're right, I might be cancelled. But I think that what I'm trying to highlight here is this danger of reducing a person's humanity to just gender and ethnicity. This is dangerous. But then back to one of your earlier questions, Mitch, what are the incentives for people to promote that message, and why do we lap it up? It's really easy, right? If we're a company, the only thing we need to look at when hiring a person is their gender and ethnicity. We don't need to look at more difficult things such as their cognitive style, their background, their experience, their style of thinking. Similarly, if we're an investor wanting to approve the appointment of a new director on the board, we just need to look at their gender, maybe sometimes their ethnicity, not other things such as their skill mix and whether that complements the existing skill set of the directors. And that's why it seems such a powerful and appealing message for both sender and receiver.
So, Alex, you're at the London Business School, you were at Wharton before, you are very much an academic through and through, Montessori all the way through this. I'd like to consider myself somewhat of a critical thinker. I'm probably traipsing more into the free thinker mind as of late. I'm constantly frustrated in these conversations because isn't this the first thing we should be teaching everybody from kindergarten and up to even in the office place? This idea of critical thinking, this idea of where ideas come from and how we look at them, how we acknowledge. Wouldn't it be great to have a session in a building with clients to just talk about what are these confirmation biases that we've assumed? My favorite one in advertising is the soccer mom persona. Like I love that one because it cracks me up. Well, you have a minivan and you live somewhere not in a main city and you're in a suburb and you have kids. You're a soccer. All of this stuff frustrates me to no end. And the frustration comes from the lack of desire even to put these into our youngest of people and even to really embed that as a cultural aspect of the work that we do. Why is it so hard to do this?
Your question resonates a lot, and I will respond. Actually, I think the glass is still half full. Why? Because
I
what I try and
agree.
stress in the book is that a lot of the ability to combat misinformation is within ourselves. We already have those skills. So there's not a single equation in the book. You don't need a PhD in statistics. I don't even have one myself. And why do I think we have the ability to be discerning ourselves? What happens if I or somebody else posts on LinkedIn a study that makes people uncomfortable, which has a conclusion that people don't like? There's no shortage of comments on why correlation may not be causation, on why this might be one hand-picked isolated example. And so when we find something that we don't like, we are able to be discerning. And so what we just need to do is to harness that critical thinking to something where we do like and are willing to lap up. And I think the first stage of this is to be aware of your biases. So there's a lot of other great books on misinformation out there which I've learned from. So what am I trying to add to this? Well, the entire first part of the book is to highlight our biases, which could lead to us actually not switching on our brains and accepting something. Just like the cure to any addiction is to recognize it to begin with, I think the cure to misinformation is to recognize our biases, which lead us to lap it up. Your point about teaching this to kids in schools, I think, is absolutely spot on. And this is something I recommend in the final part of the book. And I think it is actually not difficult. So it's not, again, about necessarily teaching statistics, but teaching about alternative explanations, like correlation versus causation. We already teach in basic murder mysteries there could be multiple suspects for a
Right.
particular crime. And we already give kids some brain teasers, and those brain teasers, and again, I give a couple of examples in the book. Those are ones where you apply a little bit of logic to highlight that the most obvious answer, the one that confirms our viewpoint, is actually not going to be the correct one. So this is something that I do believe we can teach indeed from a young age.
Right. Okay, so I'm also very curious about the ladder of misinference, which I still think in great books you'll have what I call the matrix moment, the moment that really bakes your noodle, as they say in the movie. And for me, that was very much it. I'm not going to get into details of it, but I want to read the top headlines of the four. One is a statement is not fact. One is a fact is not data. One is data is not evidence, and one is the fourth one is evidence is not proof. It took me a while to wrap my head around the depth of that because the words almost became gaslighting to me. I'd go on LinkedIn and then say, recent data shows, or the facts remain. And if I think about what you're talking about in this, again, I think the result is it is what you want to have happen to the reader, which is I'm thinking more critically. There's no doubt about that. I can maybe be a bit nitpicky. Someone might see me as a troll, perhaps, in pushing down some of this. Show me what you mean by facts, etc. Can you talk a little bit about how you came to the four and if they were somewhat intimidating to you? I mean, these are intimidating statements to think about. The idea that, forget a statement is not a fact, that we know, but a fact is not data, or that data isn't even evidence. Can you, those two in particular were ones that I really had to try to think about in terms of how we use the words and what those words mean.
Thanks. So again, I wanted to think about how can I be most helpful to the reader in combating misinformation. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of great books on misinformation out there, but many of them go through a long laundry list of all the ways in which we can be misinformed. And sometimes it can be challenging for the reader to remember all of them and to put this discernment into practice. So I wanted to classify the forms of misinformation, as you say, into four. So the first one, as you say, is easy. A statement is not fact. We just check the facts. That's the Obama birth certificate example we discussed earlier. But the difference between facts and data is the difference between one cherry-picked example and something which is true in large scale. This could be one company that started with Y and became successful. And let me not point finger at other people. Let me point fingers at my own profession because we like to use case studies. This is a big teaching method, but how do we know that that case study wasn't chosen because it illustrates the point that we want to make in the strongest way? It might not be backed up by large scale data. So a fact is not data is highlighting that we should not be swayed by a single story. Then what is the difference between data and evidence? Well, let's think about what evidence is. And again, let's go to a criminal trial. Evidence is evidence that supports one particular suspect and rules out other suspects. So evidence that the witness saw a 5'10" male in the shadows running away from the crime scene, that is not evidence if there's lots of 5'10" males who could have committed that crime. And similarly, evidence is something which points to one particular explanation rather than lots of other explanations. So let's think diversity and firm performance just to continue the same theme. If I saw a correlation between that and that correlation was robust and rigorous, is it diversity causes better firm performance? Or is it once a firm is performing well, Then it starts investing in diversity. It doesn't need to firefight anymore and can think about longer term issues like diversity. Or is it that a third factor improves both? A great CEO both improves their company's performance and she also thinks about diversity rather than there being a direct correlation. And the final part
Yeah.
is evidence is not proof. So evidence is nailing something very carefully in one particular setting, but proof is over extrapolating from that and claiming a general result. For example, Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours rule, that you can be successful if you spend 10,000 hours practicing. The evidence this was based on was one particular study of violinists. Yet he over extrapolated and says in any walk of life, for any kind of cognitively complex field, be it chess or neurosurgery, you can't be successful unless you put in 10,000 hours. You can't necessarily apply something in violin playing to all of these other fields.
Is there something here, as I'm listening to you speak, that first word, whether it's a statement or fact or evidence, that these are social things, and that really what you're talking about is data, that is science things? When we talk about data, when we talk about whatever, do you see what I'm saying? That there's this weird mix where the words that we would use are science-based, but often we're confusing with social terms or more lofty terms?
I think that's a great question because somebody might listen to this podcast or read the blurb of my book and think, well, why does this apply to me? I'm not a scientist. I'm never going to read a single
Right.
academic paper in my life. But as you say, Mitch, a lot of these things apply to social issues that we're going to encounter day to day. So whenever you read a men's health or women's fitness or runner's world, you are acting on the basis of research. What is the best way to train for a marathon?
Right.
And even if the advice is given in non-data terms, such as hydrate little and often, well, what is the evidence behind this? Is there actual evidence that if you hydrate too often, you might have water intoxication, and that is sometimes fatal? Whenever you read a story such as how daily journaling improved my mental state, well, is it actually daily journaling caused your mental state to get better? Or if you're somebody who's choosing to spend time daily journaling, you probably have a good life to begin with because you can spare the time to do that. So for anything that we want to do every day, and a lot of these things are based on self-help and self-improvement, they're not necessarily in statistical terms, but the statements made are only valid statements if there is evidence behind it.
Where are you at with behavioral economics? I mean, that's a very big trend, and I feel like there's a lot of things that happen in behavioral economics that might be just the perfect bullseye for the type of work you're talking about.
I am a huge fan of behavioral economics, and I think we should always take it seriously. So there's many economists who try to ignore it, who say, well, this is just touchy-feely and people are rational. No, people are humans. And let me draw from the best behavioral economist of all time, Danny Kahneman. So what he highlighted was there are two ways of thinking. There was the system one way, which is slow thinking.
Yep.
That is the system one way is the fast thinking. That is irrational. It's driven by our emotions. That's the amygdala, the irrational part of the brain. The system two, slow thinking, that's driven by the prefrontal cortex. It is rational. Now, in the cold light of day, system two should be in operation. So applying it to my setting of misinformation, we would know correlation is not causation. A single story might be cherry picked, but if it's a particular result that we want to be true, our system one kicks into overdrive and we accept it. So this is why understanding our biases, as highlighted by the top behavioral economists, is really important to combat misinformation, because this makes sure that we use the discernment that is already within ourselves, but at the moment we only deploy it selectively.
So there's another thing happening in our world, which is what you're essentially saying is be suspicious. Suspicious might be the wrong word, but this idea of I'm hearing what you're saying, but I'm going to have to dig deep. I'm not so sure. being overly suspicious could lead you into becoming a conspiracy theorist, which
Mm.
again is, I'm seeing a lot of these connective things. I could listen to even this conversation, Alex, and think, well, nothing I read in the news could ever be true then, or and make connections to there's a global conspiracy, and it's inspired by all these incentives for power and money, and you could easily roll down a rabbit hole even based off of our conversation. Can you speak a little bit to that idea of what is healthy suspicion? How do
Yes.
we avoid it from becoming, I could see even in myself intellectually, some things became somewhat conspiratorial. During COVID would have been a great example. Watching governments play back and forth in different regions, you would think, ultimately, what is going on here? You hear things like, oh, where it happened, and we don't want to call it, it's not related to China, but it's from China. But there was a lot of stories that emerged that even later in it came out to be not even 100% disproved, but simply ignored. Even thinking about UFOs and how,
Mm.
hey, there might be UFOs, and we just kind of grazed over that and worried more about canceling the next celebrity.
Mm.
Balance this for me, this world where we should be suspicious, but you don't want to traipse into a world where you sound like a conspiracy theorist.
I think it's a very valid question. So I would say what I'm trying to get the reader to be is not necessarily suspicious, but discerning. And we already have discernment in many other areas of just general life. So if somebody sells you a used car, you will be discerning because you recognize there's a potential conflict of interest. If your real estate agent is suggesting accepting a bid on your house, you might think their concern is more to get the sale off rather than to get the best possible price, because their incentive fee is not that connected to the price that you're going to be receiving. But we don't want to be too suspicious, as you mentioned, because then we're not going to believe anything. Then we're always going to be we're always going to be quite neurotic. So, what is the appropriate line to draw? I think this goes back to your earlier question as to proof. I think asking about for 100% proof in every situation is not necessary. So I mentioned 95% statistically, but this depends on your objective and it depends on how important the decision is. So let's say you think about whether you want your kid to play, let's say in the US, basketball or ice hockey. And yeah, it's possible, I'm sure, to do a correlation between these sports and health outcomes or maybe future career outcomes. Maybe one of them is it gives you more camaraderie and it helps build these softer skills for later in life. But you might say, well, that is not my goal. My goal is just to do what my kid wants and finds most fun and what his or her friends are doing. So these studies are very good at showing how to achieve one particular outcome. But studies in general, you focus on one particular outcome. And if we have other goals, not just financial performance or career success, then we can be much more relaxed about it. And then when the
Hmm.
stakes are higher, then we might want to apply more suspicion. For example, when buying a house, you want to conduct a survey and you might conduct a very stringent survey. And if the survey finds something is potentially a concern, you might want to commission a follow up. So I think we want to have the 80-20 principle. We will apply more discernment to the most important decisions. And when the decisions boil down to one or two specific things, if we're taking decisions based on something else, such as what is fun or what our friends are doing, we don't need to analyze everything.
Is the internet profoundly responsible for why this has become worse and or near impossible? Meaning, we used to be able to live next door to people who had differing opinions, whether they be political, religious, social, and we accepted them. We might have made fun of them behind closed doors with our relatives, but in general, we could live with them. In a world where we're all connected, where all of these perspectives can be heard, some of them factual, some of them more editorialized, you would think that we'd have a more informed and a more, whether it's critical or whatever word we're going to use to be more astute to these things. What is going on here? Look, why has all of these new voices that have come through taken us backwards and not to a place where we have a thousand flowers blossoming versus two or three?
It's true, right? You might think that information with the internet, it should make us better. We're more informed. There's more information out there. So when I
Right.
was young, I had to traipse down to the library, pick out the
Right.
encyclopedia, and read it. Now I can pull up anything on my phone. But why has the internet potentially made the problem worse? I think it's for two reasons. On the producer side, and on the consumer side. So on the producer side, anyone can spread information, such as a conspiracy theory. And if it's something which goes with the zeitgeist of the time, it's something which will be shared, you don't need to be the expert who is allowed to write in the encyclopedia. Anybody can post a video or spread a particular rumor. And then for us as consumers, we can go to whatever information source we want to. It's not just the encyclopedia, a trusted source. If I want an excuse to drink lots of red wine this evening, I would Google for why red wine is good for your health. And I'm sure I'd
The
find some particular
benefits.
studies which are demonstrating this. And because the internet just gives us so much of an opportunity to find the people that we like to listen to, we end up being in echo chambers. And if there's people that we don't like, we can troll them or say some nasty things about them, which we might not say to their face. Sometimes this could be under the cloak of anonymity. And if we get used to saying some nasty things to people we disagree with, then that's something which might come out also in our interpersonal interactions.
Yeah. Alex, tell me the one thing that made you think differently.
So, when there was the UK Brexit referendum to leave the EU, I was a very strong Remainer. I thought the UK should stay, and I thought the Brexiters were just xenophobic, uninformed people. Accidentally, I went to a Brexit talk. Now, I would love to tell you, Mitch, that I'm so open minded that despite being a strong Remainer, I wanted to challenge myself and go to this talk, but no. The reason I went to this talk was I'm an alum of Merton College, Oxford University, and this was our reunion event, and there was free champagne and the chance to catch up with my friends. So I went along, and it just so happened the speaker was a pro-Brexit speaker, and his talk was amazing. It was really eye-opening. It was very well argued. It was well researched. It was nuanced, and I didn't agree with every single point, but I certainly had my eyes open by how cogent his arguments were. And when I got home, I researched some of the more points. I had a paper on which his talk was based, and I read this, and then I wrote up on my blog the case for Brexit, which seems bizarre because I was a strong Remainer and I already had an article there called The Case for Remain. But I wanted to highlight that this was an issue where there was a credible other side. And so after Brexit won the vote, there were a lot of Remainers claiming we should rerun the referendum to have a second referendum. And I did not call for that. Number one, I think this is an affront to democracy. If a vote has been cast just because you can't like the vote, you can't overturn it. And also because I thought, yes, this is an issue in which legitimate people can have the other side. So the reason why people voted the other way was not because they were uninformed or was not because there was some cheating in the ballot process. I thought that was a fair outcome, even though it was not the outcome that I personally would have wanted myself.
God, I need more neighbors like you, Alex.
Well, thank you. And I need more like you who wants to hear nuances, because it can be sometimes tricky being in a space where people want the most extreme statement.
No, I mean, reading May Contain Lies really gave me pause to think more deeply about the work that I do. In fact, I often tell people that one of the amazing hacks I use with generative AI tools is I will input my writing and then tell it to act like a media theorist and give me every opposing perspective possible to what I just wrote. And it does. In one sense, it helps me maybe tweak things or adjust. But the other side of it is whether it's, when it's wrong, that's one thing. But sometimes it does illuminate what is essentially me being somewhat biased by my own desire for the work to be a certain way.
Yes, and this is again one of the ways in which, if used correctly, AI can help. Obviously, the big word is if used correctly, but I think this is the same with anything, with algorithms, with computers. Whenever you have a new invention, these are things where people can get overly excited about them and misuse them, but over time we learn what is the correct way to use them.
That's great. So the new book is called May Contain Lies. You also have Grow the Pie, which has some fascinating conversations about responsible business and behavioral finance, which I'd love to have another conversation with you about at some point in time. And of course, Principles of Corporate Finance, which may not be as exciting as May Contain Lies. So check that out. Let people know where they can best connect to the book, where you share stuff. Your blog has got a ton of great stuff on it.
Well, thank you. My website is alexedmans.com. The website for the book is maycontainlies.com, but you can find me on Twitter or X or LinkedIn under A. Edmans. And I post a lot there, not just my own research, but other views that I find to be interesting. And sometimes, as I mentioned, those views are different from my own, but if they made me think, I think that other people might want to hear about them as well.
And we do. So that's awesome. Alex, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Mitch. Really enjoyed the conversation.